Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's a wonderful pleasure to be here with my colleagues from the LSE, my friends from Bogota, and many other friends who I've made in Santiago and in Chile over the years to discuss this subject. I'm sorry I'm not speaking Spanish, and I feel embarrassed by that, ma potevo parlare italiano, forse era meglio. But I will stick to English so that the translators don't have a heart attack. I'm here to really pull together some of the big ideas that we've been already talking about this morning and bring them together in the context of London. For one simple reason, not because London has got it right, not because we've done everything well, but because in many ways, I think over the last 20 years, we've gone through the same experiences, the same debates, the same psychological concerns that we have about what the future of our city should be like. Everything your minister said, the Intendente Orrego said, are things that resonate with our experience in these years in London and at the LSE. And here I want to add just a personal word from my institution, from the London School of Economics. Philip Burdett has already mentioned that, of how close we feel to your country and this city. The number of LSE students, number of Chilean students that actually come abroad, a very high percentage actually, we're lucky to say, come to the LSE, and some of them are sitting in the front row over here. I'm going to talk about London in different ways. I'm going to talk about London as an architect, as a planner, as a sociologist, as a sort of semi-policy maker. But that is because you can never talk about cities in one simple way. So this image of London in a way summarizes all these issues, and all it shows you ultimately is what the shape of the city is like, with the River Thames running right through it in the middle in blue. I'm going to try by the end of my time to give you a sense of the different layers of existence and how we have to deal with those layers as planners, as policymakers, as architects, in order to make the city more sustainable. I couldn't resist showing you this picture. It looks like the front of a chocolate box, no? It looks like something fake, and it was only taken 2 nights ago. Just first of all to say, we do sometimes have days with sun, which we have to get used to in London, but it also says something about where London has traveled in the last 14 years. And this is one of the reasons. We have a mayor called Boris Johnson. We had a previous mayor called Ken Livingstone, who really, in the last 14 years, have been able to transform, as I say, a city which had exactly the same difficulties of inequality, the same problems of congestion, pollution, etc. We haven't solved them all, but through the agency, let's call it that, of a new political figure, a new political institution, many, many things have changed. My colleague Philip Burdett has already talked at length about how we, as middle-ranking cities, Santiago is similar to this, roughly 7 to 9 million, are nothing like the cities around the world which are growing at enormous speed and are much larger. But we're growing. And the challenges we have and the opportunities we have because we're going. Imagine if we were sitting here and talking about Detroit, or most of Eastern Europe, or many parts of actually Japan, where the population now and in the next 20, 30 years is going to drop. That's where you have serious problems. Here you have, just looking at the people in the room, investment, energy, and excitement about what you can do, and you're aware of what the problems are. In London, we have this problem. It's a nice problem to have. From actually no growth over the 70s and 80s, we've gone up, and even our statisticians, in fact, some of my colleagues at the London School of Economics, got the numbers wrong. We actually had 400,000 people more than we expected in the last 10 years. Now, just a reminder for those of you who perhaps haven't seen London from the air, so to speak, that it occupies one part of this tiny island on the top left-hand side of Europe. But if you see it just from the lights at night, it's actually a very dense, that means continuously occupied, but not high-rise environment. Philip has talked about that. And for those of you who know London, but also for those of you who don't know London, seen from the air, London is a mess. This is a technical term that we've developed at the London School of Economics, in the sense that you can't actually identify anything. There's no big grid like Barcelona. It's not like New York. You can only see the River Thames and then other things happening to it. One of my arguments is that the link between the urban form and its resilience and ability to change is fundamental and allows people like you to invest in it. In other words, something which is very formal and very beautiful, no offense to my French friends like Paris, is a place which has been strangled by its beauty. And in many ways, in the last 20, 30 years, it's stood behind because the planning regimes have been just too strict in terms of allowing the city to modernize and adapt. I talk about the word London as if there's one London. There isn't. There's this London. Most of London is like this. Actually, it's suburbia and it's not very exciting, but some of it is quite funky and quite cool. We've talked about density as a serious and important issue. Now, density can never be seen in the city itself, but how it actually impacts on the region. So the notion, as we heard this morning from ministers and from the Intendiente, that you need to think regionally but act metropolitanly, a word that doesn't exist, but we'll use it today, but think at a metropolitan level is very, very important. London, and here you see the outline of London in grey and the River Thames coming through it, has basically been growing, as I said, but it's actually been growing unequally. It's growing eastwards. And I will show you that it's growing where the area is poorest and has actually most space. There's a lot of ex-industrial area, which is actually perfect place to do stuff, as long as the regulations allow you to do it. So we will be talking about that and also with colleagues later on today. It's history to see this graph over the years, how London has actually dipped in population. It reached a peak roughly around the Second World War, and then by design, all the city, all the ministers wanted people to move out of London because it's too big. It was too powerful in many ways. A big debate today between the north of England and the south of England. Which should be the strongest city? Well, cities just win when they're good at it. And London has picked up, as I say, with numbers of people, and it will grow by another million in a couple of, in a decade from now. Why is it happening? Well, it's a beautiful place, it's quite easy to get to, it's incredibly expensive, and it's enormously unequal. To try and get housing in London for anyone under the age of 40 who doesn't own $100,000 a year, $100,000 a year is beginning to be really seriously difficult. So not everything is perfect, but we are part of a global network of cities which are part of the financial and services circuit. Saskia Sassen has written enormously well about this, and it's interesting, whatever ranking you look at in the world, London is sort of up there between New York, Tokyo, and of course some of the other emerging sort of Asian tigers. Now, the important thing here is to link to what Philip Roeder said earlier. To make these activities here, you see on the bottom right, the economy, research, education, universities, actually work, right? To make it work, to win Nobel Prizes, to actually talk to someone to make a deal, you need to be together. You actually need to be in a place, and Philip used the word sociability, you need to be together in such a place that it's a good thing to be. So that's good for business and it's good for social equity. Now, it's interesting that more or less anywhere in the world, with one or two exceptions, it's cities that always outperform the national economy. You can see it across the board here. Basically, people in London generate much more wealth per capita than anywhere else outside. Again, that is a pretty obvious thing when you think what is the nature of the work we do. But the point of today in many ways is to understand this and protect that vitality of the economy of the city through intelligent governance. And this is the key point perhaps I, Philip, and Enrique no doubt will be making after me. Here is a diagram of how the great city of New York in the United States of America is actually run. By the way, roughly exactly the same population and the same demographic as London, so 8.5 million, so to speak. In blue at the top, you see federal government, central government, the ministers that you had here at the table. In yellow, the regional area, the Intendiente here, in the case of New York, the state of New York. In red is the mayor, recently Mayor Bloomberg, and in green is the local boroughs, the sort of delegaciones, or what you might call in different Spanish ways, the sort of the boroughs. The yellow is very dominant in New York. It runs all the transport system, for example. It runs, or used to run, the school system. The red is pretty powerful, particularly if you have a mayor with a lot of money, like Michael Bloomberg, who bought the schools for the city. Fascinating sort of notion. The green is not so powerful. It's not just only 5 boroughs, but not as significant in policy making. Here's exactly the same map in London as of the year 2000, and I'll come back to this. We have no yellow. There is no state which actually gets in the way, so to speak, between government, the mayor, who's now responsible for the red, and 33 boroughs underneath us. And if we look at this in a little bit more detail, the mayor of London, there in red again, is responsible for 33 boroughs, all of whom have a lot of power. They elect their representatives, some of them are called mayors, most of them are called leaders, who can still determine planning issues and some housing issues, but within, and this is the key point, the vision set by someone who sits above and has the power to do things includes spending money. What you see here is that the bulk of the mayor's budget is actually spent on transport, which has changed over the years because of these two guys. On the left wing, Ken Livingstone, known as Red Ken because he was so anti-Mrs. Thatcher that he was more or less thrown out. And on the right, Boris Johnson, the current mayor, who hopes to replace David Cameron as the Prime Minister of our country. And I think in 6 years, he's probably going to be there. Now, I worked very closely with the architect Richard Rogers, in fact, for both these mayors, both as an advisor to Ken Livingstone to set up a sort of vision for the city, which is called the London Plan. I'll talk about that, and with Boris Johnson in acting as the advisor on the Olympics. And it's important to see what people like me, others sitting here, and it was interesting to hear many times the importance of urban experts in making decisions. We're quite important, but we have to have somewhere to fit in. There has to be an infrastructure of decision making, otherwise it's sort of pointless. We just become academic talking shops, and that's not very useful. The mayor has responsibility for all these things you see here, and the one point I'm going to focus on way down at the bottom is the thing called the London Plan. The mayor has to write a plan which is written every 5 years, has to be adopted by everyone in the city. Britain has a sort of profound and rich democracy, so everyone has a voice. It has to be agreed by the boroughs, but once it's set, that's it. You've got to do those things. You've got to provide that amount of housing. You've got to stop the cars from coming in, if that's what the London Plan says. And the key thing, I'll come back to this often, is that in our case, we've been fortunate perhaps that over the last 15 years with 2 mayors, there's hardly any difference in the way that the different policies from different politicians of very different ideologies, the view of the city is sometimes apolitical. It's to do with integration, it's to do with equity, it's to do with the environment, and it's to do with productivity. These are things that very few people in the modern democratic world disagree with. Now, one way, as I say, of understanding the city is in terms of its physical DNA. As an architect, I talked a bit about that. Another one, which is fundamental, and we've seen some very interesting diagrams already. The last presentation about infrastructure was, in a way, dealing with these aspects. This shows in red, in the whole of London, there you see the River Thames going through it. In the whole of London, in red, the worst, the most deprived areas. That means higher unemployment, more teenage pregnancies, less educational standards, all the problems that every city, Santiago included, has. Different parts of the world have different sorts of deprivation, but every city has this map, right? Chicago will have all of the south side in red and all of the north side in green. In the case of American cities, unfortunately, that is often related also to racial and ethnic issues. Issues we have to understand. In the case of London, broadly speaking, the edge of London, the periphery, is well off, and the west side is well off, and the east is worse. Very intelligent sociologist did this drawing, which says everything I've said in a few seconds. That basically the very rich live in the center left, and the rest of us live elsewhere, the losers. But how does one say this in a more sort of practical way. And I'm talking about all these things as an introduction to actual practical projects, right? This statistic is the most bracing one. If you are brought up in Westminster, in West London, today, and you take the Jubilee line, you take 7 stops, and you go to the east of London where the Olympics are, and I'll talk about that, you lose 1 year of life expectancy today in my city. It's the same difference between life expectancy between Buenos Aires and Quito in one city. So these continental differences actually happen in our city. And the same applies to transport. There are different areas of accessibility. Enrique, no doubt, will talk about this as a form of providing and distributing equity. So what you do as a planner, as an architect, as someone who's interested in making your city more equitable, through design, and I use the word design not just as things which look nice and have pitch roofs or curvy roofs or not. I mean design in a holistic way that is represented here. The greatest planning tool London ever had, or invention, was in 1943 when the bombs were dropping on London, to invent a green belt, a boundary. London was at that point the first megalopolis, and the planner, Patrick Abercrombie, decided London has to stop at that limit. Then you have 30 kilometers of green, and then you have new towns well served by public transport beyond it. That's effectively how the sort of physical and transport geography of the whole region works. And this is where the London Plan, which was created, as I say, in the year 2000, and then repeated in many ways by Boris Johnson in 2008 when he was elected, does 3 very simple things. And I could describe the London Plan in a few minutes. There's the boundary of London. You see it there? There's the River Thames. And as you go east in the more deprived areas, you have many industrial, ex-industrial areas which are vacant, so a lot of land. The plan says, 1, keep the boundary, the growth boundary. It cannot expand, even though London is growing. The great temptation, many of you here who are landowners and developers would prefer to build wherever you want, right? It makes sense. But it doesn't make sense in terms of the economy and the ecology of the city. So 1 is, let London grow, but do not let it go outside that edge. Secondly, identify in the little stars and the little dots special areas of growth and allow more density than is actually allowed in the local plan. That's the point of the big vision, right? And third, only allow that extra density and mix of uses where there is good public transport, right? So that idea is exactly behind Boris Johnson's plan. It's more or less the same thing. So what you have around London is a series of these stars, these dots, which are sort of privileged areas. Now, I'm not going to go into this, it's incredibly detailed, but it says one important thing. And this is where regulations in a way can make a difference. Instead of having maximum standards of density, which is what most cities around the world have. You know, here you can only build so much, X square meters per acre, or X FAR, floor area ratio. We actually in London turn this around and we have minimum standards. So if you are near good public transport, you have to build X density to make the most of that piece of land. It makes sense. You make more sense of the schools and all the facilities. And this is the idea that has been driving much of what we've been doing in London now. And now I shift from the overarching analysis of London as a city that we work and live in to understanding the projects that have happened. The biggest idea, you saw that at the beginning, is the shift eastwards, where there is land and where there is, let's call it, opportunity. But of course, like your periphery here, it is underserviced by infrastructure. It doesn't have the connectivity, it doesn't have the social goods in many ways that sustain life. So what do you do about it? Well, the first thing that was done, and this is simply because of the power of the mayor, even if he doesn't have the money, to sit with these people and lobby for cash. As a result of Ken Livingstone being the mayor of London in 2000, the decision was made to build this very, very important high-speed link across the whole of London, most of it underground, in fact, a bit like the French, the Parisian RER, right? At the cost of 23 billion. The mayor lobbied, and actually got this done. This is being built in London today, and it will transform the way, effectively, people will move around London. It's pretty good public transport, but it can be very congested and can get better. The most important diagram of this story is here. If I take the red from the social inequality map I showed you before, the deprivation from before, right? And I show you the black line of Crossrail, going through it, there, you will see that actually Crossrail serves some of the reddest areas, some of the most deprived areas. This means that over the next 20, 30 years, by definition, you will get increased investment, increased density, all win-win scenarios. But you need that upfront investment made by who? Central government with private sector support. But this is where, when I hear so much in the Chamber of Commerce discussions and with the University of Development, who of course I thank enormously as being our host for this event, when I hear the discussions about public and private, it's great, but in what context? Where's it all going to go? Whose interests are actually being served? So this is not in any way being critical, it's just folding it back into the institutional and visionary framework. Now that Crossrail 1 is about to be finished in 2 or 3 years' time, they're already talking about Crossrail 2, which is the green line cutting across London diagonally. And the great and late Peter Hall, one of the greatest planners ever, who died unfortunately only 3 weeks ago, came up with a much simpler idea, which has actually been implemented, to use existing mainly old commercial trade rail routes, which were more or less there, to do what? Connect things this way, not just this way, or across. In other words, to provide a sort of radial connection. This has triggered one of the most successful pieces of infill development that London has ever had. You begin to find good housing for young people in places that seemed far away in our mind, but actually because of this system is actually very, very accessible. So let's look at some of the projects. Big theme from the London School of Economics and LSE Cities is that transport, density, and accessibility are what are the triggers for the future of sustainable cities. King's Cross is pretty well connected, one has to say. There are very few places in the world which have connections all the way across continental Europe with a station of that quality, and all the way up to the north of England and what was going to be a separate country but isn't, Scotland. What is interesting about these buildings is that they were the first railway stations more or less ever built, because London was the first to actually introduce in the 1840s railways to bring goods from the north. We have this extraordinary legacy, as you do, of different sorts of sort of history. You need to renew them. So what was done here is an old and beautiful station needed new facilities. It's like bringing new heart to an aging body. And this is what this fantastic new station actually looks like. But much more importantly for us today is not just making nice spaces and good shops, is that how do you take advantage of good public transport? Well, this whole area, which you see in brown at the back, is a $3 billion, £2 billion, totally private development by a group called Argent PLC, one of the most successful groups in the UK, totally funded by pension funds, private pension funds who don't think 5 years, they don't think 10 years, they think 40, 50 years, like governments should, right? So that's the very interesting sort of issue for us here, which is if you're going to turn this area, which is happening before our very eyes in London, into the next integrated place where maybe 40,000 people will be living in the next 30, 20 years and working like that. So there's before, and this is what it's going to be in 7 or 8 years from now. How do you actually do it, and where does the public and the private come in? Well, clearly, the fantastic accessibility of these two stations and what happens on the ground is unbeatable. But investment was made to improve it. This is what the area looked like. All the architects in the room, the developers recognize this is a nightmare. It's the worst possible problem you can have. Everything is polluted, it's got stuff on the ground. How do you do it? Well, you put money up front, you try and get grants to actually clear the site, keep what's good, and then most importantly do this. Take an area that was cut off from its surroundings because railway goods yards, gas holders are cut off. They don't want to be friends with the city. They were designed not to be. So how do you make it friends with the city? And one thing is connectivity. Make sure that every street from the surroundings goes through the new neighborhood and make most of the assets which are already there. Put as many shops, activities, cultural too, at the ground level so everyone benefits from them. And in a way, you get a piece of city. I mean, it's in some ways so obvious. It's just extraordinary how everyone in the world, everywhere, any planner, any developer, and every city regulator still thinks in the outdated 1960s model of zoning and separation. This model works, not just as a sort of emotional statement about, well, wouldn't it be nice to have cities where people walk in the streets and hang out together? It's not that. Google is moving its European headquarters with 12,000 people here. Why would they go here? Because they want the buzz. They want the young people who are going to attract it to work for Google and keep them on top of the world to have a place where it's all happening. So these are the numbers you get. And often, you know, we all talk about projects in these ways. But it's the soul of the place which comes from this big vision for London. So public space is central to that. This beautiful old building, 200 years old, in front of it has this, now one of the most successful public spaces in London. My son and daughter, if they're going to go anywhere cool, it's here. You know, they don't go anywhere, so central London anymore. It's completely boring. And you know, this also means that you attract other users. The University of the Arts in London has moved its headquarters into that old building and added new architecture, which means 5,500 young people are there every morning, night and day, effectively, because it's fashion and architecture and design, animating the space and keeping it, you know, sort of busy. So this is why you suddenly have these sort of aspirations on the ground. Let me stress for you who are cynical about developments happening without public sector support, $3 billion of private investment. And I spoke to the head of the development the other day. He said they're just about to start making money. That means it's 17 years of planning, getting your financial backers to support you, in the knowledge that actually this is going to pay back. You know? So it's all to do with the... Now, I love getting at New York and saying that we do it better in London, you know, obviously. But there's exactly the same project happening in Hudson Yards in New York. Many of you will know about it. And there's the project. Now, I don't even need to tell you what this is going to be like, right? It's like Canary Wharf on steroids, right? It's going to be a place that some people will go, it will be fine, there'll be a shopping center, and you might live in an apartment if you're very, 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 very rich, but it's not part of the DNA of the city. And you know, I think that's what we need to understand. Back to a few more projects before I end on the Olympics as a sort of many ways the biggest challenge to us over the last years. Where we have good public transport, in London we've decided, put big buildings there. It's very straightforward. So right under this tall building by Renzo Piano, now the tallest in Europe, we have one of the most busy, in fact probably the busiest commuter station called London Bridge. You see it falling right on top of the station. The most significant thing about this building, and Enrique knows these statistics now by heart, it has 10,000 people working in it and 47 car parking spaces for disabled people only. Not one car parking space is actually allowed there. And the way it meets the ground is gentle. You feel part of the city. You actually don't know that that building is there. Now, if I were unkind, I would say when I look at tall buildings around the corner from here, very, very tall buildings, the tallest in South America, I understand, it doesn't meet the ground in the same way. It doesn't feel like it's part of the city. And I think these are the challenges. The City of London, which is the financial hub of London, which has been there for nearly 800 years, effectively, doing the same stuff, every single new project for the last 20 years, every single one, this is Broadgate next to Liverpool Street Station, more pictures of that, have always privileged public space, linking back to Philip's key point about business transactions and sociability. You need the place where people meet and do things and not alienate themselves. So the new generation of beautiful buildings, this is Richard Rogers' new building in the middle of the city, opened only effectively last week. The whole of the bottom 7 floors of the building look like this. You don't know you're in corporate world. This belongs to literally everybody. Of course, the rents in this place have gone up enormously as a result of this. Looking from the city further east, we now begin to sort of complete the picture of the way that London is growing and how it's changing. But according to this vision that I set out before, which is shared by the mayors and everyone involved in making decisions in London. And in the background, you see Canary Wharf. Canary Wharf was built in the darkest red area of London, the highest deprived area. And actually, I have to say, today, the borough around there, called Tower Hamlets, is still pretty deprived. And it was all to do with the refurbishments of the docks, and it's a very 80s story. This is how it was done. That's what it used to be, water, buildings, this is what it is. I don't knock Canary Wharf. 100,000 people work there. It brought life and jobs to a whole area. But I think it's the worst piece of urban design I know anywhere, right? Look at it. It's isolated. It's got nothing to do with anything around it. If I walk around it with my students, as I sometimes do, they stop me on the street and say, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm walking around the streets." "No, you're not allowed to. It's private." Right? So it's the approach about what it means for the city. So, since people at Canary Wharf are incredibly intelligent, and maybe some of you are investors here, so careful, what is happening there is very interesting. Having discovered the importance of public transport, and Crossrail now joining there, they were one of the biggest lobbying group with the mayor to get Crossrail to be built, and put quite a lot of money into it, not as much as the government. The result of that is that you see the site in the foreground next to you in the picture. They bought that 10 years ago. It's called Wood Wharf. The result of the transport connection which I described, and the planning regulations that are described earlier about having minimum density standards in well-connected places, is they have planning permission for that. That's a hell of a lot of area. That's 8 million square feet, sort of 800, nearly 1 million square meters of new development. And 30% of that is actually going to be affordable housing because of the mayoral requirements. So it's, I think, a win-win, and I feel much more optimistic about what's happening. Let me conclude the story about London, where it's been going, what the trajectory is with the Olympics. Because, frankly, the Olympics is the biggest challenge of them all. We all know cities around the world that have messed up the Olympics fantastically, right? I mean, poor Athens, I love my Greek friends, but not a good way to spend a lot of money when you're about to go bankrupt. It didn't make Athens go bankrupt, but it helped, put it that way. And Beijing was a completely different story. London had to decide to have the Olympics. Why? What was the point? London is on the map. It has 24, 25 million visitors a year. It doesn't need to sort of amplify that. London has one problem, and I've talked to you and shared it with you already. I hope you're now with me. It has inequality at its core. It has inequality east-west. I'm now simplifying it. This area where the yellow dot is here look like that. That sort of is a symbol of everything that is problematic with it. The different boroughs around it have the worst deprivation, not in London, in the whole of the UK. Right? So lack of education, unemployment, particularly serious problems with white teenage males, while the Asian females perform much better. So life is much more complicated than we sometimes think. Remember this picture for a moment. This is right at the heart of the site, and it was a dump next to railway areas, a dump used where refrigerators and other equipment were basically deposited. I'm sure my fridge must be there. By the way, think of the pollution that actually that sort of causes. The site was acquired by the government through compulsory purchase order, what is in American is called eminent domain. And as you see, it's a messy site. It's incredibly cut off by railways. It's incredibly cut off by motorways. It's got some industrial buildings, but it was really a very difficult site, spatially and very importantly, socially. And we won the Olympics. We were very surprised to beat the French, and apparently we won the Olympics because Jacques Chirac offended so many people when he went to Scandinavia that the Scandinavian vote went to London, and apparently the Greek representative pressed the wrong button, but so we won. Then we found ourselves, well, what do we do? What's the agenda? Well, the government voted this budget, which is $13 billion, and importantly, a large section of that budget went into regeneration and infrastructure. What is interesting that literally this week, and I'll end on this in a moment, we're now running a competition in London to accommodate some of the top universities and the top cultural institutions in central London who are dying to move or start a new campus, a new activity over there. I can tell you, as a member of the team that sort of thought this through, I would have never thought that in effectively 11 years we'd be in that situation. So investing in the legacy through infrastructure is exactly what this story is. So you saw the money. This is what the site sort of looks like. Half close your eyes, it looks poetic, except for polluted river and telegraph and electricity pylons. You know. And you all know here in this room how much it costs to get rid of those things. But if you've got £7-8 billion pounds, you know, you can spend the first 300 doing this. We spent £300 million demounting these, putting it underground, very expensive, but immediately liberating the area for development. These three maps are in many ways the important ones. We don't need to go through it in detail. What is important is what's written at the bottom. We did a plan for the Olympics. We then thought on the right-hand side, what do we want this piece of city to be like in 2030, and how do we transform it? Okay, and I'm going to take you through the plan in a few minutes left. There's the site. It's got very nice water and some green land in it, so why not create a park in the middle of it? It had hardly any connections around it because it was a railway area and industrial. In fact, only one street going through it. We built 38 new connections, bridges, and pedestrian routes. Where there's very good public transport, which there is, build a lot of housing and jobs. So one of private development brought in by Westfield has a shopping center with now 10,000 jobs, mainly for local people. Build only the venues that you actually need, right? And all the other venues that you don't need. We don't do basketball, we don't do swimming or strange things like, swimming we do. We don't do outdoor sports like water polo. So only keep the ones you need. Once you've put all this investment in and you take away the venues you don't need, you remain with this diagram. You remain with platforms for development which then go out to the market. And that's exactly what's happened. And what are they? They're well connected, they're clean, they've got very good sort of energy provision, and they're easy to get to. Just look at this bridge down at the bottom. You see there's a white bit and there's a brown bit. The white bit is permanent. The brown bit was added because you had 180,000 people going backwards and forwards to it. We designers convinced the investors, the government, when this is going to be a normal piece of city in a community, you don't want a bridge literally as wide as this room, right? You don't want that. You'll feel pretty isolated. And so design the bridge in such a way that it can be reduced in size. That costs a little bit more money, but if you design it in a sort of way that you can actually sell the steel and everything else, that's what happened. The same thing goes to the buildings. This is the Aquatic Center designed by the wonderful Zaha Hadid, great architect. Unfortunately, during the Olympics, none of us saw it like that. We saw it like that, and it was ugly as hell. Now, ugly as hell because it has these two lateral wings, which are about actually keeping extra seating, in fact 12,000 more seats for the Olympics, because you sell tickets. Now, this is going to become a community swimming hall. You don't want 17,840 empty seats there when your kid is swimming, right? You don't want that. So it was designed to take those wings away. This opened 3 weeks ago, and now this is a fantastic pool which everyone in the community actually uses for a very, very small subsidized amount. The Olympic Village, interesting story, funded by the government, is now being sold to two different groups. The private part, 50% of it, to the Qatari royal family. Now, would I have thought that the Qataris were going to invest in East London 10 years ago? No. And the other part, very importantly, 48%, in fact, to be correct, is for social housing in an area of desperate need. So we're building, in fact, environments of that sort, which are not unlike what actually London looks like. Remember the mountain of fridges? Yeah? The mountain I showed you, that's the same spot today. Right? So, you know, that's a transformation. This is what is actually going to happen to that area in terms of new housing. And very importantly, I told you that in this area, next to the stadium and the swimming pool that you see on the right, is where a competition is being held for universities, institutions, and a whole mix of fantastic organizations which we would never imagine happening there. So apart from the sheer money side, right, and this is important, no government will ever invest in anything. In an institution and an audience like you, not talking about real money doesn't work. You get Oxford Economic. Oxford is a minor university somewhere outside London, which says that actually the numbers which are being talked about in return on investment is in the order of $7-8 billion a year. One begins to really talk about legacy in a sufficiently successful way. I'm going to end in 3 minutes, if I may. This vision, as I say, of the Olympic Park, very architectural, spatial vision, fits into the big plan, London plan vision of creating centers, well-connected neighborhoods for the whole of London and just not for parts of it. That's the key thing. It's an architectural diagram, it's nice, but it fits into the bigger picture. With Alejandro Gutierrez, we've shared this approach, in fact. And it's interesting to see in red the Olympic site over there, but it's actually one of a series of pieces which have been developed as London goes east. And in fact, that is exactly the approach that is being used in Creo Antofagasta. Now, let me end by sharing with you, in a way, an interesting personal dimension of when you get involved in these things. I've been working with the former head of the London School of Economics, Howard Davies, as one of 5 people advising the government of where to put London's next airport or build a new runway. And these are more or less now the options which have been looked at. Heathrow Airport, a third runway, Gatwick Airport down the south, or as the man who is very important in London, the mayor, wanted to actually close down Heathrow and to continue the story of London going east, actually build a whole new hub in the Thames estuary, of course called Boris Island in his name. My committee, Howard Davis's committee, looked at this and actually said, it's a great idea, Boris. It's a great idea, that's what it would look like, but it just doesn't work in terms of the DNA of London's economy. If you close Heathrow, you then rebalance, you have got a whole series of structural and other problems. So we said no to it. I'm not going to be invited for his Christmas lunch anymore. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.